Almighty Father in heaven, in the name of your Son, our glorious and victorious Savior, Jesus Christ, we humbly ask for your blessing upon our worship of you on this, your holy and sanctified Sabbath day, so that we may grow more in our knowledge of you, our love for you, and our obedience to you. Blessed are the undefiled in the way, who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are they that keep his testimonies, and that seek him with the whole heart. They also do no iniquity. They walk in his ways. Thou hast commanded us to keep thy precepts diligently. O that my ways were directed to keep thy statutes! Then shall I not be ashamed when I have respect unto all thy commandments. I will praise thee with uprightness of heart, when I shall have learned thy righteous judgments. Amen. Today is sermon number 7 in our Complete Holy Bible Reading series. We will have, as I mentioned when we began these, next week there will be 2 sermons, one for Nisan 14, and one for the first day of Passover or first day of unleavened bread, which will be about that very subject, why the two different names for the very same thing, but 2 very important points of the very same thing. But which means there will be no regular weekly Sabbath next week, because as it happens sometimes the first day of unleavened bread, which is an annual Sabbath, falls on the weekly Sabbath this year for next week. So the next 2 sermons will deal with Nisan 14 and the first day of Passover, first day of unleavened bread, those 2 sermons. And then the week after that we'll also have 2 sermons, but for the 7th day of unleavened bread, but which does not fall on the Sabbath. And then we'll be back to our regular Sabbath schedule again for our Bible readings. And if you're new, if you've begun reading these now, or reading along with us for the Bible reading, please don't skip the holy days, because we're going to get to those. We're only in Genesis right now, although the basis of them is already there. Actually, the basis of them was there right from the Garden of Eden, from Christ and everything else, which we'll cover in those studies and sermons. Studies that have been done already, and the links that are included with them in the sermons. So just to mention that actually it will only be one weekly Sabbath, or what would have been one scheduled reading for next week, and then right back to it again. But there'll be 4 sermons in the next 2 weeks, 3 for the annual holy days, or 2 actually, the 1st and 7th days of Passover and unleavened bread and Nisan 14, and then back to the regular schedule again. There is much to learn from the Bible, and I know if you're new, or even if you're not, sometimes I've actually heard from some of those with a Worldwide Church of God background who had the terminology in which there's been a controversy in there, particularly with the terminology used for Passover or the days of unleavened bread. And there is the question of, from that, as we'll discuss completely in that sermon, but why it's called both things. And I don't think the Worldwide Church of God did. They sort of separated Passover and the first day of unleavened bread, and there is a separation, but they're of the same thing. One is the sacrifice, and the other is the acceptance of it, the coming out of putting sin out of our lives. But the reason the Jews call it the first day of Passover, because for them it is, and the reason that Christ always observed it as a Jew on the 15th, which is when Jews still observe it. I believe that the Worldwide Church called it the night to be much observed, which it was. It was the night of the Passover. But it was already a matter of as much the Passover then, because that's when it happened in Egypt. But again, Christ, when he came to be sacrificed, was in his grave that night, that first night. And actually people will argue about that one, like so many other things. But we actually have got a full coverage of all of those controversies now, except for that one, why the terminology of both, specifically sermon for that, and we'll do that next week. So, but just to mention, without too long an argument or discussion, without too long of an explanation there, but just to let you know that what's coming, because many people I've found are reading the Bible for the first time along with us. This is their first reading, and that's good, because it's getting them even actually some atheists, I've heard from some atheists who had big problems with so-called Christianity, obvious nonsensical things, nonsensical doctrines, because they could tell it wasn't the way anyone in a logical mind could think, and yet this is, because the Bible is a logical book. It's true. It's the way things really happened. It's a nitty-gritty book, as I've said. There are a lot of things in there that may be uncomfortable as a matter of things that happened, but they're normal people. Just they were no different, other than the fact that they lived long ago, but they were humans, the same as everyone else. The saints of the Bible were real people. They didn't have the sun disk behind their head, and they didn't have the vacant stare and holding the church steeple thing in their hands and all of that, because they were real. They were real people. They were nitty-gritty people, striving to overcome this world as it is. And it's not easy, but they did it, and so can we. They were our example in that way as well. I know it's a shock to some people who, particularly in a lot of ways, atheists have an advantage in they don't have to unlearn a lot of stuff. They haven't had the indoctrinations from all the so-called churches of Christianity, because they don't go easy. They don't appreciate much of the Bible at first until their time of calling has come, which is true for all of us. But it's difficult to shovel away all this material that people have been given, that has been foisted upon them, upon their good hearts and good intentions. They want to be Christians. They want to obey God. They found a way, they think, go to one church or another, and then they find out, according to the Bible, it was not quite accurate, or not accurate at all. And it's a problem. And some people take offense. And a lot of people take offense at what we teach here. But that's not the reason. We're not going after you. We're going after Satan. It's that simple. The lies, the deception. If we come on a little strong sometimes, it's not you. It's Satan we're after. One person sort of compared it sort of like ramming the gates of hell, figuratively speaking, and going up and down the streets of hell, kicking over Satan's doctrinal trash cans, trying to provoke him to come out and fight. And of course he won't, because of the truth. He won't. And we're told of that in the Bible. Obey God and the devil will run from you. And that part of it's true, going into the gates of hell, because even figuratively, there is no hell yet. Other than the grave, that's the only hell that exists. But figuratively speaking, it is sort of true in that we're after the devil's deception, not the people, not the victims, not his victims. It's his victims get mad. And in that way, actually that analogy is correct, because he doesn't come out and fight. He won't. He hides in his house, peeking out the curtain as you're kicking over his trash cans. And they're full of trash, these doctrines. But the people who do come out are the innocent people who are living off of that trash. No offense intended, but it's trash. It's doctrinal trash. Some of the teaching, going to heaven when you die. That's not what the Bible says. That's not what God says. God says he's coming here. Or people, the immortal soul. Well, according to the Bible says your soul is your body, and it dies. The soul that sins is going to die, stay dead. All these things, the realities, even the very cross, we put the link on for a study we just did, the very symbol of Christ, the cross, is a fake. He wasn't crucified on a Latin cross. He was crucified on a capital T-shaped cross. And people know it. It's no great secret that sort of we come up with. Even Mel Gibson knows it. In the movie The Passion of the Christ, they have the two thieves, if you've seen that film or video, the two thieves are on the actual true crosses, so they did know it, but they ignored that reality and put Christ on a Latin phony cross. But they've got, even when they know the truth, they're still, the grip is so strong, and that's the trash part of it. That's trash. It's not truth. Putting Christ on the true cross, what would that have hurt? He had the part about the beating certainly correct. That's very hard to watch, but it was accurate. Biblically, that was accurate. He got that part right. But then hanging him on a Latin phony cross invented by Constantine 3 centuries later, that he supposedly saw in the sign, in the sky, and in this sign go conquer, the Crusades and all of that. That never happened. It just never happened. Maybe Constantine saw something, but it was either a hallucination or just a phony vision from Satan, considering what the cross has been misused for. And this great struggle now between so-called, even the Crusades themselves, between so-called between Christianity, Roman Christianity, and the Mohammedan world, or Islamic world. Well, what difference does it make? They both reject Christ, and and there's the people of Judah there. Well, most of them do too, still. So it's the world right now is under such a grip of deception, and that's the deception we're aiming at, not the people that are being deceived, but they're the ones that get angry. Satan, it's true, he won't come out and fight, but he uses people to do his fighting for him. He's a coward. He's the ultimate coward, hiding behind little children. Ultimately, he's the one that does it. So just to mention that, this will be sermon number 7, and then there will come next week for the upcoming sermons that's on there. If you're listening to this now, as I sort of have to do this in a three-dimensional way, because people might be listening to this some years from now, and that schedule won't be there. But I mentioned if you are listening to them now, the schedule for that will be on that, and also our updating our calendar, our holiday calendar will be updated as well for that. So continuing today, our Bible reading beginning today, Genesis chapter 37, and as we've covered up to now, the basis for what would become the nation of Israel was there. Israel himself was there as a person. He was not a nation. He was simply a man with a rather large family, a number of wives and concubines, and a number of children. But he wasn't a country. He wasn't anywhere. He was still a foreigner living in this land. He would remain as such. He would be moving down to Egypt, remain a foreigner there until the day he died. He would be brought home, buried in a foreign land. He wasn't buried in Israel. He was buried in the land of Canaan. I think Jacob is going to be one of the most surprised people to see how subsequent history from his time developed from his name. I think he would be absolutely amazed. I'm sure he was aware of the Exodus, because he was aware of the prophecy of the Exodus that was given to Abraham. We'll link the link on for that, the Exodus prophecy. Abraham obviously knew about it. He would not have told Joseph, his son, to ensure that he would be buried there, if not the idea, the fact, the reality that his own family would be returning there. We don't know what happened to the other patriarchs. We could assume perhaps that they were buried in the land of Israel, or the homeland. We know that Joseph was, and that he made sure that his bones would be brought up. He's the only one mentioned as such. Moses did fulfill that demand, that request, that requirement centuries later, considering that Joseph lived at the beginning. He lived a long life there, but it was still, they were there for over 4 centuries before they left, and they had Joseph's bones. There is no mention of the other patriarchs. We know they all went down to Egypt. We don't know if they came out, and it's irrelevant anyway, but it's an interesting question. Many people wondered. I do get questions like that sometimes, but there's no record, so how can I answer it? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. We can assume one thing, or we can assume another, but we'll know when the time comes, and if we had to know now, it would have been recorded in the Bible. Genesis chapter 37, and Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. To interject there. See, they were foreigners, all of them. Verse 2, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. And it could be the terminology such as it was there, but Bilhah and Zilpah were concubines. They were not regarded as legal wives. Perhaps they've been sort of promoted at that time, although concubines were viewed on a legal basis, just sort of a different category of wife. But it's interesting they did use the term wives there. Whether that's just merely a translation on the part of the King James or not is irrelevant, but the fact is that their children, their sons, were as much patriarchs of the 12 tribes, of some of the 12 tribes, as those of the other two, so it made no difference in that regard. Verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him, and could not speak peaceably unto him. And surprise, surprise, family favoritism there, that we've read of that already with Jacob and Esau again, how that sort of there, and Jacob now repeated it. Although it was actually because, as we'll get to, more a matter of the wife that he truly loved in her early death, and actually a fondness, actually why he would eventually, later on, when Joseph had children down in Egypt, that he adopted those two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and made them, sort of promoted them from grandsons to sons. So hence the reason we got, depending again the counting, the controversy there, how the tribe of Joseph became the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh together, and so on. Verse 5, and Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright, and behold, your sheaves stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said unto him, shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it his brethren, and said, behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him, and said unto him, what is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to the earth? Stop there. Well, was he just sort of becoming arrogant there and having dreams and saying things? Well, no, they were God-given dreams, and as we'll see, those dreams we had in Egypt got him to become the prime minister of the country, but that was fulfilled when Jacob came down to Egypt later on. Joseph was the prime minister. He was second only to the Pharaoh or the king himself. So that happened. It wasn't just a matter of a hallucination or some sort of ego fantasy. It happened, and it was a God-given dream. But it wasn't liked. Brothers didn't like it. The father didn't like it. Verse 11, and his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. So there's Jacob. He was a little sly. He was a thinker. He didn't just do things. His brother Esau, if Esau got mad, he wouldn't just sit on a sword. He would draw it and deal with the situation. Whereas Jacob, he was a little more of a thinker. He wanted to see what was going on before he made his move, which is a good thing to do. Verse 12, and his brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. Shechem is up into what is today Samaria, sort of the mid-country of what became the land of Israel. It wasn't then, but Samaria is between Galilee in the north and Judea in the south. And his brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem, or Shechem. And Israel said unto Joseph, do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, here am I. And he said to him, go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren, and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Vale there, of course, King James word for valley. And a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, what seekest thou? And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flocks. And the man said, they are departed hence, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren, and found them in Dothan. And when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, behold, this dreamer cometh. Now stop there. Why did they have to do that? Why did they think they had to do that? If the kid was just a dreamer, so what? It was something, he was a teenager, well, maybe he was just in the cusp between childhood and adulthood. He was adolescent. He was just thinking. He was just and being ambitious. Maybe he wanted to be somebody someday. What's the problem? What was he taking away from them? Why did they react like that? You ever wonder about that? He was no real threat to them. He did have the father's favoritism, yes, but the others were established. They had no reason to fear being cut off or anything like that. But they took it in a very strong way, to say the least. Verse 20, "Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit, and we will say, Some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." Now how could they, again, to interject, how could they kill their own brother? I have a brother. I couldn't imagine killing him. We aren't really that close, but I couldn't imagine killing him. Just can't imagine that. It's just, particularly, I couldn't imagine killing anybody unless they were trying to kill me. Lawfully, we have a right to defend ourselves, but somebody who's just some kid who's had a dream, think about it. Why were they being so, what was there more to it? Were they being helped along in their emotional state, shall we say? And the answer we'll get to is yes. Verse 21, "And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, Let us not kill him. So Reuben, eldest son, oldest firstborn, said no. The oldest brother said, No, we're not going to kill him. Verse 22, "And Reuben said unto them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands, to deliver him to his father again." So there was Reuben saying, no, let's just throw him in the pit. And Reuben was planning, well, he'll come later on and take him home to his father, score a few points with Dad in the process. But, verse 23, "And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph of his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt." Now, stop, just a rhetorical question, but it's along the same principle. Here they were coming, they had spicery, balm, and myrrh. Does that mean there were 3 of them? 3 Ishmaelites? Can we tell the number of Ishmaelites from the cargo? No, can't, can we? And yet many believe that from the wise men of the gifts that were brought to the Messiah, the newborn, much later, of course, that there were 3. And nowhere in the Bible does it say there were 3. We know there was more than 1. That's all that tells us for sure. There might have been 2. There might have been 3. But there might have been 10. There might have been 4. There might have been 20. We don't know. The Bible doesn't say. Just a point. Verse 26, "And Judah said unto his brethren, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood?" And to interject there, I actually heard someone say to me one time, there is of course the anti-Semitic thing where people of Judah or the Jews are always looking to make a dollar. And here is the original Jew, Judah, the patriarch of the Jews. Right away, he was looking to sell the brother. They will actually use things like that to twist the things like that. But, Judah didn't create the situation where the traders were going by. He didn't create the situation where all the brothers would have actually killed him. And at least Judah was saying, going along with the older brother Reuben of not killing him, at least, whatever, he wasn't planning on getting, at least they were going to kill him, weren't going to kill him. Selling him away, well, it's just about as bad, but, maybe the kid can find a way back later on. Although it's unlikely they would have wanted that to happen, because then their whole scheme would have got them into trouble with Jacob. But anyway, verse 27, "Come, and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brethren were content. Then there passed by Midianites merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. And Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes. And he returned unto his brethren, and said, The child is not, and I, whither shall I go? And they took Joseph's coat, and killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the coat in the blood, and they sent away the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father, and said, This we have found, we know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And that's King James sort of twisted English. They're asking a question there, or actually they're saying something. Seems as though he's making a statement or asking a question. And he knew it and said, It is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And that's another thing, what a heartless thing that did to Jacob. He was getting up there. He's an old guy by then, and it could have literally broke the old man's heart, killed him from stress. It happens. That didn't seem to bother them very much. Jacob, he was part of the dream as well, and that people are just heartless within families. There seems to be no bounds when it comes to that sort of thing. Verse 35, and all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, and he said, For I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. And again, as I said, he could have killed him. That happens where people, we see oftentimes where people who've been married for a long time, one will die and the other will die not long afterward, just from stress or just giving up a willingness to live. And it can happen just from the stress of it. And here was Jacob, very much the same sort of situation. So they were heartless, their sons. It wasn't just a matter of convenience of getting rid of the kid or young man. He was 17, but it was heartless. And again, the reality of the Bible. We think of all these wonderful saints and everything, but these guys are regarded as saints, and they will be. Most of them, I think, are going to make it into the kingdom of God, obviously, by virtue of the fact that who they were and the responsibility that were given, and perhaps they were given a little more leeway as a matter of judgment in order for the responsibility that they were given. There's a balance. There is no favoritism in that sense, but King David is another one for that. Perhaps King David, if he'd have been just a regular guy doing that, might not have the same judgment. But again, it doesn't mean that David was allowed to get away with anything, but David, it'll balance out because of the responsibility. He's going to pay for it in another sort of way as he gets there. But verse 36, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. And so we come to the end of chapter 37, which again, the reality of the Bible, of things like that, how all of that works out. The reality is just, it's life. It's just human life. You can look at that, or a story like that could happen today. You could read about something like that. Imagine in a family, one of them, the youngest one, was having dreams, and he was already the favorite of the father and mother both, and the sibling rivalry and all of that. It's old, but it's new. There's no difference. The human nature has not changed, no matter how far back you go. The only time it's changed, of course, was in the Garden of Eden. We were created sinless, sinless humans. There have been, actually, it's reality. Don't misunderstand me when I say this, but there have been 3 sinless humans. Adam and Eve, when they were created, they were sinless for a while. They became sinners. And Jesus Christ, who was sinless and stayed that way. He's born sinless and remained that way. But being sinners is not our natural existing now in an unnatural state. We are not as God created us. We are as Satan has deceived us and perverted us with his attitude, with his mind. We were created with the mind of God, but we right now have to fight off the mind of Satan. It's why it's easy to beat Satan at his game, because we know what he's thinking, because he's doing a lot of our thinking for us. The attitudes and the way, once you realize it's happening, that's the key. As I said, he doesn't fight his own fights. He has no defense against the truth. He has only offense, and that people take offense at the truth. People who have yet to realize that they're being conned, the great deceiver. But once you understand it, it's easy to see what it is and how it is, and you start seeing it everywhere, and then you start speaking the truth, and people don't take it very well. But they will later on. When their time comes, they're going to be happy. They're going to say, good job, you did okay. You did all right. I'm talking about you, because you've all, if you can really hear what the Bible's saying, you're taking it from your family right now, aren't you? If you're in someone, I've said this so many times, I know of a few families actually, in which everybody has come to an understanding of the truth at the same time. And you should, if you're a family like that, you should consider yourself richly, richly blessed by the Lord. because most from what I've heard from anyway, it's rare. It's very rare. Usually it's split right down the middle, or more often within that, just one. And they get, as soon as you start really seeing the Bible for what it says, you get sort of declared to be the family strange person from then on. But you're not strange. You're God's. You're within God's light now, whereas they're still in the darkness. And again, the offense. Satan's taking offense at you by offending people who hear your truth, whether you're just living it. Just living it. It's a testimony of it. Genesis chapter 38. It's sort of an inset chapter as a matter of the Israelites going down to Egypt, as a matter of what's happening or was happening with Joseph at that particular point in time, although years went on there as well, as we'll read. But we read now something else very important, that is the beginning of the people of Judah, known today as the Jews, the original Jews, the first Jews, because I'm amazed. I hear people occasionally, I just don't watch them anymore, I just can't do it, but occasionally people, those TV evangelists, I've watched a few in my time, and I've been amazed at how some of them who have doctorates in theology will call the Israelites Jews, or will call Moses a Jew, or Abraham a Jew, and things that just are biblically nonsense, that they're not true. And just, you wonder, have these people really ever actually read the Bible that they proclaim to be teaching? And I'm hoping, really, I don't know what would be worse. I guess the innocence would be in a way better if they never did, and they're just teaching lies out of ignorance rather than having read it and know the truth and just lying about it anyway. Because we're about to read here the original, the birth of the first Jews, when it became what became known as Jew. And Jew is just an abbreviation of Judah. That's all it is. And we'll put the link on for the study that we have. For the first Jews, because it's important to understand that while all Jews are Israelites, not all Israelites are Jews. There were 12 tribes, or 13 if you want to count Joseph being split. That hasn't happened yet. This is happening as we're about to read here was happening. Joseph was down in Egypt. He was about to be married in a couple of years. He was going to do a couple of years in prison on false charges, as we'll also read. But now is the beginning of the people of Judah, from the descendants of Judah. Genesis chapter 38, and it came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren and turned into a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hirah. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and he took her and went in unto her, and she conceived and bare a son, and he called his name And she conceived again, and bare a son, and she called his name Onan. And she conceived yet again, and she yet again conceived, and bare a son, and called his name Shelah. And he was at Kezeb when she bare him. Now stop. Very important, considering the conflict today between the people, Jews, the people of Judah, and the Canaanites who are in that land, the struggle that's going on. The first Jewish children had a Canaanite mother. We just read here. Judah married a Canaanite woman. Now, was he being bad? Was he being unfaithful to his family? Answer: no, he couldn't have married anyone else, other than if he had gone back up into Syria. But again, as a matter of principle of marrying Israelites, it wouldn't matter if there weren't any. The only female Israelites at that time that existed was Dinah. She was a child of Jacob, a child of Israel. The wives, Jacob's wives and concubines, weren't Israelite in that they weren't his children. They were his wives. They were his cousins. Two of them were, Leah and Rachel. But you see what he had to do. He married, and again, how the gospel there is of all people. We talk about the chosen line, the chosen people. Well, there's Canaanites in there, because the first Jew, as in the first people of Judah, I'll put the link on for that, had a Canaanite mother. Right from the word go, right there. Verse 6, and Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. Stop there. Once again, she had to be a Canaanite. They were in that area. he couldn't marry within the Israelite family because there weren't any. There was only one female Israelite at that time, and that was his sister Dinah. So he married daughter-in-law Tamar. I almost said married, but we'll get to that. Verse 7, and Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. And Judah said unto Onan, go in unto thy brother's wife, and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother. And Onan knew that his seed should not be his, and it came to pass, when he went in unto his brother's wife, that he spilled it on the ground, lest that he should give his seed to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, wherefore he slew him also. So the first 2 Jews were killed by the Lord. And again, that's shocking, and that's not anti-Semitic. Don't bother sending me stuff like that. This is what the Bible says. There is nothing like that there. But again, the nitty-gritty reality and the Canaanite connection there, very important, very, very important. Continuing, and it's very important because of who the chosen people are chosen for as a matter of Christ. It isn't about the people of Judah being chosen as being more favored than anyone else. It wasn't a matter of the language, because the other people of Israel had it. Same thing. But it was a matter about Christ, and He's the Savior, the Messiah of all people, including the Canaanites in His ancestry, as in Christ's ancestry, because He goes back through David up into Judah, and then the branch to the Canaanites. The Canaanites could claim, and I'm surprised they don't, Christ is their descendant as well, because He was. From that original wife, but now also the daughter-in-law, because watch, verse 11, then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah, my son, be grown. For he said, lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. And in the process of time the daughter Shua, Judah's wife, died, and Judah was comforted, and went up unto his sheep-bearers to Timnath, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And it was told Tamar, saying, behold, thy father-in-law goeth up to Timnath to shear his sheep. And she put her widow's garments off from her, and covered her with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place, which is by the way to Timnath, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given unto him to wife. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be an harlot, because she had covered her face. So you can see what's coming here, but keeping in mind as well, she was a widow, and he was a widower. So what was about to happen was not an act of adultery. Fornication with a harlot, well, that's another matter, but again, the Bible is a nitty-gritty book. There's no way around that, folks. That's what it says. Verse 16, and he turned unto her by the way, and said, go to, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee. For he knew not that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what wilt thou give me, that thou mayest come in unto me? And he said, I will send thee a kid from the flock. And she said, wilt thou give me a pledge? Wilt thou give me a pledge till thou send it? And he said, what pledge shall I give thee? And she said, thy signet, and thy bracelets, and thy staff that is in thine hand. And he gave it to her, and came in unto her, and she conceived by him. And she arose and went away, and laid by her veil from her, and put on the garments of her widowhood. Now, to interject there, what she was really doing, keeping in mind what we just read about Onan, that if a son died, or if a husband died, the brother could continue the family. That son would have children for him by means of having children with the widow to continue the family line through. And this is what Tamar was doing, which instead of using the brother, she was using the father. But continuing, verse 20, and Judah sent the kid by the hand of his friend the Adullamite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he found her not. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, where is the harlot that was openly by the wayside? And they said, there was no harlot in this place. And he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. And also the men of the place said, there was no harlot in this place. And Judah said, let her take it to her, lest we be shamed Behold, I sent this kid, and thou hast not found her. And it came to pass about 3 months later that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot, and also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, Bring her forth, and let her be burnt. Now, you can see there the margin of law that's being touched upon here. Because really what she was doing legally from within the family that she never left, his response here, it wasn't just a matter of him being a hypocrite, because that wouldn't have saved her if that's all it was. If that's all that was involved, they would have burnt her anyway. He would have been a hypocrite, and they would have burned her. But consider verse 25. When she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, By the man whose these are, am I with child? And she said, Discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet and bracelets and staff. And Judah acknowledged them and said, She hath more righteous than I, because I gave her not to Shelah my son, and he knew her again no more. There was a matter there. What she was doing was claiming her right to have children through her deceased husband by means of the son, but the son was withheld by the father. So she went to the one who was responsible for withholding that law, that legal right that she had. It was a rather roundabout sort of way, but the thing is, what other option could she have? She couldn't just take it to court. She couldn't demand it, because family, at that time, family was decided by the head of the family. There was no legal recourse. She had to do what she did. She was smart. She was very smart in what she did, and the legality of it worked out. And the fact that she held those things as proof, the signet, the bracelets, the staff, the very emblems of his head of the family that were in her possession at that time, she had him. She had him. And she accomplished what she was trying to do. Verse 27, And it came to pass in the time of her travail, that behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass when she travailed that one put out his hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, This came out first. And it came to pass, as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. And she said, How hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Pharez. And afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was Zerah. And again, it was through that line, Pharez. You can read the genealogy of Christ, that the line of Jesus Christ to Judah was through Perez there. So obviously the Lord approved of what happened, even though the Lord, keeping in mind, had put to death the first two sons because they were wicked in the Lord's sight, including Onan for getting the whole thing going by refusing to do what he was legally required to do for his brother's widow. So it was a roundabout sort of thing as it happened. But again, you can see the Bible is a nitty-gritty book, for lack of a better term. It's a real book. It's not something that you read about in Sunday-keeping churches or in a lot of other places. In the true Church of God, they just sort of ignore those parts because they have this idea of what righteousness is really about. The people of the Bible were real. They were real folks. Genesis chapter 39, we get back to Joseph. As I said, it's a good place for the inset. It was certainly important for that to be in there. And the identity of the beginning of the people of Judah is very important. And again, the point about the Canaanite, that it's there. Many people think, well, the Canaanites are evil and just hunt them down, kill them all. But, the people of Judah originated half of their ancestry through a Canaanite woman. And then another one, because Tamar, as we said, it couldn't have been within the family as marrying an Israelite because there weren't any. It's just a matter of the reality. And again, getting back to the fact that Abraham was not a Jew, he's an Iraqi, what would be called today an Iraqi. And the others up in Syria were from Syrian, although from Iraqi background. And now Joseph, who will be the father of two other of the Israelite patriarchs, sons of Joseph, would be adopted and, as we said, promoted, for all intents and purposes, promoted from grandsons to sons. We'll get to that. But they had an Egyptian mother, and the Egyptian folks were not white. They weren't northern Europeans. They were black folks down in the land of Ham. And so it's almost certain that Ephraim and Manasseh were what would be called today black. And that certainly rattles a lot of people. A lot of you talk about races. I mean, think about the idea of some of the things that the portrayals, as happened, a lot of the classic artists were Northern European, white Northern Europeans, and everybody was a white Northern European in the Bible according to them. But that isn't what the Bible says. And again, the realities are there. You can either handle the reality or you can go and play in Fantasyland. And unfortunately, a lot of people choose Fantasyland, even when they know the reality. They'll argue that point. I hear from people who say, well, David wasn't a Jew. Well, the Bible says he was. And, on and on and on it goes. So, Genesis chapter 39. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, and Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. So, technically, the Israelites, and Joseph was an Israelite, he was the son of Israel, began their stay in Egypt as a slave, and they left as liberated slaves, but certainly Joseph did not remain a slave, but continue. Verse 2, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord had made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had put into his hand. And a question there about grace, and it's a very good example. Does that mean that Joseph could just sit around and do as he pleased all day? Or behave in whatever, he could live there in his master's house, but he could just do as he pleased, or do nothing at all, just sit there and watch the boats go up and down the Nile all day? They didn't have television or didn't have internet, so they had to watch something. But is that what grace was about? Or was it about obeying his master? Grace in his sight. Think about it, because that point, that principle, was no different for anyone. And it's certainly no different as a matter of so-called New Testament grace. Verse 5, and it came to pass, from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. And it came to pass after these things, that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Though, keeping in mind, this is centuries, literally centuries before the Ten Commandments, including the one against adultery, but notice the term he's using for not committing adultery. A sin against God. They understood it. That righteousness, the same righteousness that Abraham understood. But notice there he was second only to his master. He would become second only to the Pharaoh for the very same reason. That eventually, after being falsely accused. But even that was the means by which he would come into the service of the Pharaoh, as we'll get to. Joseph, he didn't have a pocket recorder, to sort of record what someone is saying, whether it be a threat or something like that she was doing, and then later deny and cause him a whole lot of trouble. He didn't have one of those. We sort of have advantages, technological advantages today. A lot of people could try something like that, and it wouldn't work by their own words. And of course, justice being such it is, you would let it go and let them really dig themselves a hole before you prove them to be liars. So, the old saying, give them enough rope to hang themselves. Verse 10, and it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within, and she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand, and fled, and got him out. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath wrought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled, and got him out. Now, why was she doing that? She was taking a risk there. She was most obviously suspecting that Joseph was going to report her. So she sort of preemptively struck, putting in the first accusation. And of course the man was going to believe his wife over a servant. But she obviously, if she had nothing to fear from Joseph, she would have remained quiet about it, because at least that way there would have been no suspicion at all. But, well, continue. Verse 16, and she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him, and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. And the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So again, he did it again. He became in charge of everything of Potiphar's household. He then got falsely accused, thrown in prison. He was put in charge of the prison, second only to the warden. So it was natural there was a build-up happening there. And it was for that reason, as we'll get to, that he became the prime minister of Egypt. It was his access to the king, the Pharaoh. And that brings us to the end of chapter 39. Genesis chapter 40, all of this must have been just sort of like a bad dream in a way for Joseph, being sold by his own brothers. He must have known that his father was either accepting of the situation or had been told something in order for them to get away with it. Otherwise, his own brothers wouldn't have done it. Being put through all of that, probably living with the daily reality in his own mind that he would never see home again. And although he was blessed, there was no indication that he knew of them coming. He later on understood it, but he didn't at the time. And then having just sort of been made the best of a bad situation, serving as a slave, albeit rising to the head of it, then being falsely accused and thrown into prison, because here he was being thrust into these situations. He was obviously rising to the very top of wherever he was put, and he was about to do it again here, as we will read. But for him, it was just like it was like being bounced around like a bubble from one pot to the next. He'd always float to the top, but he was being thrown from one situation to another, and he always ended up at the bottom, floating to the top again. And again, about to happen here. Genesis chapter 40. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And some may say, well, that's sort of strange. How come a butler and a baker would be chief among the officers? But these are people who had access to the king. And people like butlers could get up close and stick a knife in the king, as happened, to be assassinated. Or the baker could poison him, so it's got to be someone who's highly regarded. It's certainly in their best interest. The king's health and well-being is in their own best interest to arrange that sort of thing. The people who are most loyal to you in that regard are those whose own self-interest is your self-interest. And by putting them at the very high position in the government sort of a thing, it certainly would be far better off for them than they would have been working at this very same profession in the private sector, so to speak. So they did something. It doesn't say exactly what they did, but they had caused great offense. Could have been just one matter or another, as a matter of suspicion or something they said, but whatever. Verse 3, and he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream, in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. So again, a lot of dreamers there. Verse 6, and Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. And of course, if you can look forward a little bit here, the prophet Daniel did the same thing, and he rose to be second to the king of Babylon, just exactly as Joseph did. So there seems to be a godly plan there in purpose, and how the Lord arranges that, how the Lord impresses the powers that be, the worldly powers that be. Verse 9, and the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said to him, In my dream, behold, a vine before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grape. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup unto Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner, when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, to make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. And when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days, yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants, and he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgat him. So there's Joseph again, still stuck there, and as we'll read, another 2 more years, he was stuck in a dungeon, and it couldn't have been a very nice place. He may have risen to a very high position in the dungeon, but so what? That's not very nice place to be, regardless if you're at the top or the bottom. I suppose it's better to be at the top of the place. At least there's not everybody coming at you, but nevertheless, it was not a good situation. So there he was, able to not only have his own dreams, and the irony of what got him sold off into Egypt to begin with was his own dreams, and now he's having to interpret other people's dreams. But they were all God-given, because the prophecies that were given to Joseph, they came true. They weren't just some kid having fantasies. They were given to Joseph. His brothers reacted in a bad way. You can look at the question, well, why couldn't, because it was a matter of there was a drought coming, and why not just put rain upon the land so that there wouldn't be a drought and all of that? Well, but then that wouldn't be the real world again. The world as it is, the world weather is going to be perfect in the kingdom of God, but until then, the land of Israel is its natural laws. And even the coming out of Egypt, all those plagues, they were real. They were based on actual things, on realities. The plagues of locusts and everything that is there, the plagues of plagues upon the cattle and upon the people and the flies and the dead frogs, because the river was full of blood, and it was full of blood. Blood is real. It's not a matter of some foreign or very exotic substance in the water. It was blood. Blood is blood. And when nature taking its course, the animals were driven up out of the water, and frogs don't do well on dry ground. They die, and then when they die, they return to the earth, and that's the biology of restoring something to its elements can be a messy process, the land and so on. So it's all there, and all the plagues of the weather, flattening the crops. It was a natural thing. The Lord could have done it in any way that He chose to do it, but it was done in a very natural way. In the droughts and so on, even Abraham, he was down there. But again, the purpose of Abraham going down was there to maintain or to obtain the wealth that was able to maintain Abraham as a person apart. He never had to become a part of that nation, the part of the world that he came out of, because it would have been the same thing. They all had to live in it, and it was just the reality of the world as it was. But again, you can see the Bible's a real book, and that's probably the most surprising thing that so many people have. It's like they're expecting to just read something out of this world fantasy land book, because that's what they've been taught to think of religion or the Bible, and they're sort of shocked that it's a real book, and some people take offense at it as though you're somehow bringing it down. Oftentimes I hear this one, you're not uplifting, as though the truth is not uplifting. But the thing is, what was Satan's rebellion about? Well, he tried to put his throne above the stars of God. He uplifted himself, and he was brought down, so he was deception. And people, the same principle is there. They're uplifted by lies, deceptions. And the truth seems to be to bring them down, when really all it's doing is telling them the truth. It's uplifting in the sense it's life. They've got their directions backwards. Satan's uplifting you, but he's doing it in a downward sort of way, not upward toward God. But again, people can't, and we all know what that's like, don't we? We all know before our conversion, whether we were Catholics or Protestants, or Catholic Protestants, same thing, or members of other religions or no religion, the attitude is common. It's just the Bible doesn't seem real until such time it's made real. And even then it's a struggle, because we have to overcome the fact that people were real, and they overcame. But we're real. That's the lesson. That's the point of it. It's the bottom line. We're real, just as earthy as any of them were, and they made it, and so can we. But we have to live in the real world, such as it really is. And that's the part, once you sort of grasp that understanding, you can go with it far better. We have to live as we are, imperfect as we are. It's the idea of the high and mighty up on a pedestal preachers. Well, look at the lesson that's been learned there within the Church of God. I'm not talking about all the others, because their judgment isn't there yet. If they haven't got the understanding by means of the Holy Spirit, they're not being judged yet. But those who do have it within the Church of God, look at the example of that. The lesson there. Things that Christ said don't do. Don't call someone Mr. or Master. It's the same word in English as it's translated. Don't do that. But what do? They do it. You're all brethren. Don't lord it over one another as the Gentiles do. But what do? They do it. The very things that Christ said not to do. So is it any surprise then that these organizations sort of reach a critical mass and then they collapse? Is it something really surprising that if you're doing something the Lord says not to do, don't do that? That's my part, the church government thing. If you read what Christ actually says, it's a stark difference. I know people can interpret it one way or another, but if you just leave yourself out of it, it's not easy to do, I know. But just read the Bible as if you don't exist. You get yourself a much clearer view, because oftentimes the biggest obstacle to really seeing what's there is ourselves, our own shadow casting. We become the light, and the light casts the shadow under the book when it should be the light shining towards us, and there's no shadows at all. Except behind us, we're not looking behind. We're looking in front of us toward the light. The analogy is there as well in the Bible, as we'll get to. Genesis chapter 41 then. More dreams, this time the Pharaoh's turn. And again, keep in mind how in this particular manner, Daniel rose to be the prime minister of Babylon in exactly very much the same way as Joseph did rise to become the prime minister of Egypt. So it's interesting the parallels there, and they live centuries apart, two different directions geographically, but exactly in the same way. Also, we'll put on the link for a study about Nebuchadnezzar, who was a Babylonian king who was converted. Actually, part of the Bible was written by that Babylonian king after he was converted and came to understand the Lord. After the Lord sent him out into the backyard to root around for a few years. A rather amazing part of biblical history as well. We'll put the link on for that. Genesis chapter 41, and it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine, and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. So keeping in mind as well, there's Joseph in a dungeon for 2 years. The Lord left him there for 2 years, but he was growing up and he was becoming tough. He wasn't just a palace pansy, as so many people around him would have been growing up. It was the same reason again why Moses was sent out. He was raised in the Pharaoh's palace, never knew a hard life or a tough life or a life that he would have had to be serving the Lord as. So the Lord had that incident happen where Moses had to leave Egypt, and he lived out there in, guess where? Sinai, where he would lead the Israelites for 40 years after that. So he learned the hard lessons, but he was also at the same time he was able to lead. He had a wide range of who he could be serving. He wasn't just sort of someone who could only function in one area of society. He could handle anybody, and on their own terms. It wasn't a matter of getting down into the muck with somebody, but just being able to handle people, because believe it or not, people are people. It isn't a matter of wide range. It's just really a matter of understanding that people are people. And once you got that key, that understanding, that commonality of all people, you can deal with anybody. It's not difficult. But in order to know that, you have to have experiences, some high, some low. And they certainly had them. Verse 3, and behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. Kine there, King James Version for cattle. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon their stalk, upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt. To interject there, we'll be hearing more about those a few centuries later. Not the same ones, but the same principle. And all the wise men thereof, and Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. And again, exactly the same as Daniel. The wise men, Nebuchadnezzar didn't even tell them the dream. He was already well aware that they were fakes, were highly suspecting of it. He didn't even tell them the dream, but again, the wise men first, and then the Israelite one, not because he was any smarter or better, but because the Lord was enabling him to understand. They did exactly the same, Joseph and Daniel. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servant, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, So it was, me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee, that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me, and God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Again, exactly their sort of response from Daniel. He was not taking the credit. He was saying nothing of the sort. He recognized where the power came from. It was from the power of God, the interpretation. Any fake can interpret a dream. But Joseph was doing it by means of the one who gave the dream to Pharaoh to begin with, just as Nebuchadnezzar was given. Verse 17, And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And of course he would have, if he were out in the desert with the Nile River. We'll put the link on for why did they go to Goshen. It was based upon the river. It flows northward through Africa, through much of eastern Africa, up into the rich Nile Delta region. It sort of spreads out, delta-shaped, sort of V-shaped, and it's a very rich area. All the residue, the organic matter, flows toward the Mediterranean, but it's deposited in that rich Nile Delta region. Many places the topsoil is only a few inches. In the Nile Delta, it's measured in feet, very thick, and organic matter holds moisture very well to begin with, but the river was watering it. They weren't depending on rain. That's why it was going to happen. But even that was going to get worse. But continue. Verse 20, And the lean and the ill-favored kine to eat up the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored, as at the beginning. So I awoke. And I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good, and behold, 7 ears withered, thin and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And to interject there, the east wind, again, we'll put the link on for that study. A major miracle that was done, the parting of the sea, crossing of the sea, the fantasy image in the very famous and otherwise pretty good 10 Commandments movie that's usually shown at the time of Passover, time of Easter. It was anyway, network television. Most people got the DVD now. And by the way, as it happens, sometimes Easter falls on the same time, around the same time as Passover, but they're the ones that are sort of, they created their own dates for the dates of Easter and so on. It was actually a monk. If you do a little research on that, it was a monk who was trying to put together, a Roman Catholic monk who was trying to get together an Easter calendar. He was the one that came up with the BC and AD system, which did not exist at the time of BC. Verse 24, And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears, and I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, The dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. So as we said, the dream was given to the Pharaoh, just as it was given centuries later to Nebuchadnezzar. So no man could interpret it except the one the Lord had given the interpretation to. And it was Daniel later on. It was Joseph here. And 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good years are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine, they came up after them, are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. All the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. So, to interject there, boom and bust. If you're a farmer, you understand that. You have even a garden, you can understand. Even a flower, some years are better than others, depending on the weather. Verse 32, and for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, it is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the fifth of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And to interject there, corn is the King James rendering or word at the time for grain in general, not North American maize. They did not have that there. Actually, maize came to be called corn by the pioneers who were English at the time, but it was the word that did not mean maize, it meant grain. And as we'll read later on by the time we get to the Exodus. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? So good for him. He understood that God was there working his power of nature, of creation, and look for a man with Holy Spirit who understood it. Well, he didn't have far to look, and certainly he must have had someone just immediately in mind, a rhetorical statement. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there was none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, according unto my word shall all my people be ruled, only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And you can't help but wonder, poor Joseph, was he saying to himself, here we go again. It happened to me in Potiphar's house, and it happened to me in the prison where I did all that, and they left me there anyway. He must have been thinking, what's going to happen this time? But as far as we know, nothing bad happened because he seemed to hang on. But then the purpose was brought about in that the family of Israel, which around 70 people is all there were, counting Joseph already there, were to have provided to them the means to go to Egypt. Not as a matter of, and again, the greater principle of that they were living in Canaan, but they were living in God's green earth, planet Earth, not planet Israel, or planet as a matter of humans having the right to do it. He looks at it in that way for himself, but it's his creation. It's his planet. It's planet Lord. If you want to look at it that way, put a label on it. It's planet Lord. He created it. It's his. Belongs to him. He decides the weather. He decides where people live, and we're seeing the evidence of that. Verse 41, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck, and he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. So stop there. At least Joseph knew, well, if anybody gives me trouble, it's going to have to be the Pharaoh himself. It isn't going to be somebody's wife. It isn't going to be any of the trouble that had been happening up to that time. And you can't help but wonder whether Potiphar's wife was getting a little bit nervous by that time when she saw that, because she's the one that lied and got him thrown into the dungeon to begin with. And even Potiphar himself must have been wondering, my former slave is now my boss. Not only my boss, but the boss of the entire country. Joseph had the lives of both of them in his hands. Verse 45, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-paneah, and gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Stop. Keep that in mind, because that lady is about to become, before long, the mother of 2 of the Israelite patriarchs, 2 of the tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. And again, keeping in mind these are not northern white Europeans. I know that's hard for some people to sort of get their minds around, but that's the reality. And even Joseph himself had a typical Middle Eastern appearance. So a lot of the art is really propaganda. The northern European artists, it's flat out propaganda, most of it. there's lessons there. I mean, it helps to illustrate particular places, but some of it is silly. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in that we know how long Joseph spent as a slave. He was sold when he was 17. He became prime minister at age 30. So 13 years he spent either in the dungeon. We don't know how long he was in Potiphar's service before he was falsely accused and thrown into the prison. But he was there a long time, and he was subject to that bottom of society situation for 13 years before he rose to the very top, second only to the Pharaoh himself. So that's quite a rise, wasn't it? But again, he knew and understood the bottom from the top because he lived it. He was there. He understood the whole thing, and he actually grew up into it as a matter of the formidable years in that time from 17 to 30. It was his character. It was the perfect time to shape someone's personality, and there it was. Most of who we become when we're right in that age area. The greatest lessons and the greatest scars too, and it happened to him during those years. But it wasn't just something where he was in jail for a week on a false charge. 13 years is a long time, but it built his righteousness. Look who he became. Look what he was. And even as we'll get to, his reaction to his brothers, what he could have done to them but didn't. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls, and he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food in the field which was round about every city laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, till he was left numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God, he said, hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenteousness, and by the way, we'll come back to Ephraim and Manasseh. We've got lots to say about them, but in due time here. Verse 53, and the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said, and the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened up all the storehouses, and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because the famine was so sore in all the lands. And that brings us to the end of chapter 41, and it presents the purpose, the reason why why Israel would go down thereafter into the land of Egypt to live the rest of his life there at that time. But famines happen. There could be, people debate that, well, why would the Lord have a famine? There's obviously some purpose. It could be anything from something as worthy as insect control, just to keep down insects, because they'll die off as well during a drought. If they don't have water, if they don't have plants to eat, it's going to be something as that, or even rodent control, very same thing. Just it has a natural purpose. Although, unfortunately, it also has a matter of human population control at the same time. But again, there is a reason for everything, and obviously there was something good about that drought because the Lord brought it about. And the Lord doesn't do bad things. Thank you for joining us for services this week. As always, your being with us makes our joy complete. Until next week, when we meet again on this, God's holy Sabbath day, may the Lord bless thee and keep thee. May the Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. God bless you all.